Hello, I'm very glad to see you. This is a wonderful day. It's a day the Lord has made, and we will rejoice and be glad in it. Whatever time you're tuning in to this study, I hope that all is well with you. We are now in chapter 10 of Zechariah, and I hope that you have read ahead. You've read chapters 10 and 11, which is what we're going to be looking at today. We're nearly, we're nearly finished with this study, and you'll be happy to know that we're already preparing for the next section of studies, which will be in what is called the 12. You may be more familiar with the minor prophets, but the Jewish name for that is the 12. And we're going to be looking at the 12 as after we finish the prophet Zechariah, who of course is one of them. Zechariah is the longest of them, and is probably the only one that is commonly studied on its own. So anyhow, let's look at chapter 10. This is about the way of blessing. We've read some difficult things. We've heard from the prophet of his own concerns and also from Hashem on his plans. But this is what is asked of Hashem. Ask Hashem for rain in the spring. Adonai makes the rain clouds, and he will give them showers of rain, grass in the field to each one. The way of blessing, first of all, is to ask of Hashem. You may look at this and say, well, but God knows our needs. He does know our needs. He knows our needs more intimately than we know them. But nonetheless, part of our interrelationship with him is making requests and pouring out our needs before him. For all spiritual needs and for all physical needs, from the smallest things that in many ways you might think are insignificant to the greatest. God is ready and willing to provide all the needs as requested. These promises to Israel take into account literal rain upon the land. Anyone who's been to Israel knows that it is a dry country. It is like most of the Middle East. It is, some of it is desert, some of it is high desert, Jerusalem, for example. And this doesn't mean that nothing will grow there. It simply means that you have to have water. So asking for rain is almost the most basic of needs. And of course, we all know that if the rain doesn't fall at the right time, that it might as well not fall at all, because it can in some cases ruin the crop or be too late. God is ready and willing to provide for the needs that we have. And this This literal rain is mentioned in Devarim 11, in Yirmiyahu 3, in Yoel chapter 2. The early rain and the latter rain. What does that mean? Well, the early rain is as the crops are being planted. The late rain is at the end of their growth. As surely as literal drought caused the desolation of our land, literal rain will be restorative. Now, you may not know this. I didn't. I never thought about it. But the more trees you have, the more rain you have. That's the way it works. Israel has been busy planting trees since before it became a state again. Back in the 1800s, our people began returning to a land that was completely desolate. And by desolate, I mean it was wasteland. Nothing was growing there. And anyone who had been there, for example, Mark Twain, writes about it at length during his visit. And there was just nothing there. It was desolate. Our people began to plant trees. And we've been planting trees ever since. We plant trees today. Why? It adds to the ecosystem. We've always known this. If you didn't know it, well, plant a tree. Storm clouds are the forerunner of rain. And of course, the result of rain is fruitfulness. Rain is also representative of all the blessings of God, which sustain both temporal and spiritual life. Early rain, spring showers in March and April are representative of spiritual refreshment after a long winter of cold and dryness. Because, of course, in the climate of Israel, as well as in California and other places, it doesn't rain in the winter. The latter rain is the autumn to winter rainfall. Usually, rainfall ends about the time of Sukkot. And this was necessary to begin the process of pushing the seeds into the soil. What is necessary, we're being told, will be given in the right season and in great abundance. Hosea chapter 6 echoes the words of our prophet. Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn and he will heal. He has struck, but he will bind up. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will raise us up, and we will live before him. Let us know. Let us press on to know the Lord. His going forth is sure as the morning. He will come to us as showers, Geshem, as the latter rain, Malkosh, that waters the earth. God is Israel's only source of help. The contrast between God and idols is demonstrated in the way in which Israel has been deceived through the use of pagan and heathen enchantments and divinations controlled by demonic spirits. Teraphim are household idols. Remember when Rachel and Yaakov left her father's house. She stole her father's teraphim because it was thought that control of the teraphim implied power over the family. Our people placed their trust in these false deities and their representatives, which tell the people what they want to hear. The people are like sheep. They are without a true shepherd, and thus they are open and vulnerable to enemy attack. And this is always the case when people are shepherdless, either because there are no shepherds or because they choose to be lone rangers. Or, of course, when the shepherd is not providing proper guidance for the flock. Because they have placed their faith in idols, they ceased to seek after Hashem. They've been deceived about the future by these false prophets of the idols. They are afflicted with apostasy and the consequences of occultism. God's anger is kindled against Israel's leaders, specifically the Kohanim, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the princes. These shepherds have led Israel astray. He-goats, this is a reference to foreign rulers, persecutors and tyrants oppressing Israel because she had lost her rightful shepherds. The bellwether, this is the sheep that leads the flock with a bell on its neck. God will not only punish, he will also use Israel as an instrument of his judgment against these rulers and oppressors, as we will see in chapter 12, verses 1 through 9. In the time of God's restored favor, Israel will enjoy the beneficent and benevolent rule of her own princes, particularly, of course, King Mashiach. Israel will be cured from the deceptions that she has previously experienced. In Yeshayahu 28:16, it speaks of the cornerstone. Look, pardon me. Look, I am laying in Zion a tested stone, a costly cornerstone, a firm foundation stone. He who trusts will not rush here and there. That's an interesting expression, isn't it? Not rush here and there. Do you know people like that who rush here and there? They go here to listen to this. They go here to listen to that. Of course, now they don't have to go anywhere. They can sit in front of their computers and they can listen to all the rubbish that flows by on the internet. And some people do that. They listen to one thing after another, thinking if I am listening to all of these things, I will be able to discern what is true. They rush here and there. This cornerstone, however, we're told will come from Yehuda, and it is the foundation upon which the renewed and revived Israel will be built. And we have references to this in Daniel, in Yeshayahu, and in Mattityahu. But it is also a stumbling stone, a rock of offense. Romans 9, 1 Corinthians 1. It is the stone cut without hands, Daniel 2:34, which will destroy the Goyim, the Gentile world system. This revelation to Israel will be the foundation of truth that will forever banish all deception and blindness. It speaks of a tent peg. Tent peg is driven into the ground, and tent ropes are attached to it for support. Any of you who've been camping probably know this. Mashiach will be the support of the nation, holding us fast to the solid ground of truth. What is truth? It's truth with a capital T. It is God's truth. It is the real truth. Also inside the tent or built into the wall for hanging items of value for display, Mashiach is the one upon which the glory of God will rest. Yeshayahu 22:22 is used by Mashiach Yeshua of himself in Hittigalut 3, verse 7. He is the peg which holds the key to the glory of the Davidic kingdom. And I will place on his shoulder the key to the house of David. He shall open, and none shall shut. He shall shut, and none shall open. Absolute authority, absolute control. The battle bow, well, this belongs to the supreme warrior. Again, we read of these in Tehillim 110, Hittigalut 19. The battle bow of the supreme warrior will end tyranny and oppression, politically and governmentally. All enemies and aggressors will depart from his presence and from Israel. Yehuda will have a decisive victory over all enemies because God is with us. Enemies will be trampled underfoot by the valiant armies of Israel. The cavalry, the horse soldiers, of course, are considered to be the most important at that time, and up until really after the First World War. The horse soldiers of the enemy will be confounded, ashamed, and amazed. These are the strong backbone of the armies that come against Israel. All Israel will share in the blessings of God as if our relationship with him had been eternally unbroken. How incredible. He will cause all of us to return to our land. All of us. And he will cause us to dwell there in peace and complete security. There will be a full reconciliation that will take place between Israel and Hashem. Yosef, or Ephraim, is of course representative of the 10 northern tribes of Israel. Like Yehuda, they will be empowered by God. And we know, of course, that the two will be back together as one. Both fathers and sons, representative of the generations of Israel, will rejoice in the victory that God has given them. They will exult because God's presence is with them. He is their source of joy. Yes, God will regather Israel. We've seen a regathering. We've seen a restoration, but it's only partial. We're going to see the full ingathering of our people. God will regather Israel like a queen bee whistles for her bees to return to the hive. As the signal a shepherd gives with a rough reed or a bamboo pipe to gather together his scattered flock. God has already redeemed or ransomed us from exile and from iniquity, but now Israel shall be called the holy people, the redeemed of the Lord, sought out, a city not forsaken. Yeshayahu 62. Israel will increase remarkably in number. Despite everything that has happened to Israel, our nation will be mighty in population. At the beginning of the 18th century, there were only about 3 million Jews. And now, despite the destruction of many more than 6 million in the 20th century, the worldwide Jewish population is now larger than ever before, approximately 20 to 21 million. Jewish Israeli influence is far out of proportion to our relatively small numbers, and certainly the attention of the world is focused more on Israel than any other nation of its size. Incredibly, really. But as there is an increase when a field is sown, so Israel will increase because God has sown her among the nations. The enemy would seek to use dispersion to harm Israel, as in Egypt, but God would increase her numbers in spite of Hasatan's best efforts. We saw that in Egypt, and we see it even among the nations in the greatest, largest dispersion, which has only really ended or ending now. God will increase our numbers. Yeshayahu 49, verses 20 through 21, the day will come when the children born when you are mourning will say to you, this place is too cramped for me. Give me room so I can live. Then you will ask yourself, who fathered these for me? I've been mourning my children alone as an exile, wandering to and fro. So who has raised these? I was left alone. So where have they come from? Among the nations, many people of Israel will remember God. They will return to God and to their own land. It says specifically from Egypt and Assyria. And of course, we have certainly had those returning from both countries. Gilead and Lebanon, both sides of the Jordan, represent all of Israel's homeland. That's right, all of it. God will remove all the barriers to our return, as in the Exodus. Egypt represents the oppression of Israel's enemies, and Assyria symbolizes the pride of Israel's enemies. But restored Israel will be strong in the Lord. Israel will be renewed living a Torah lifestyle representative of Hashem, and doing all in His name. Of course, we can easily look today and see that that is not yet fulfilled, but it will be. May it be soon and in our day. Here are some thoughts on chapter 10. The historical school of biblical interpretation, which of course has no place for the people of Israel in the present or the future, regard this chapter, and of course many others, as having been conveniently fulfilled in the time of the Maccabees. However, it's interesting to note that Rabbi David Kimchi, who lived 1160 to 1235, also known by the Hebrew acronym as Radak, a medieval rabbi, biblical commentator, philosopher, and grammarian from France, and many other Jewish scholars of different places and times place the events in this chapter as we do in the future, in the days of Mashiach. God reminds Israel that He is the source of our help. We need to be reminded because we're always looking for help from other sources. We should pray daily that our people will come to see this truth even now. We are reminded that we can do nothing in our own strength. We must look to Hashem for direction, support, encouragement, and wisdom. Look at Ivritim 4:16 and Tehillim 46, verses 1 and 2. We have today a good shepherd, the one who protects us and keeps the enemy away. But God has also provided us with human shepherds, rabbis, teachers, who provide necessary encouragement and strength and counsel, and may guard us from the dangers of this life if we give them the opportunity. God declares that many of our people will remember Him and return to Him while in the lands of exile. This very clearly pictures Jews who have returned to Hashem through Mashiach Yeshua's atoning sacrifice in our day, in the past, and in a growing revival, which will conclude with the final ingathering of Israel. Our heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel, like that of Rav Shaul, is that they might be redeemed. In the day of Mashiach's kingdom, Israel will serve as a righteous example to the nations. God calls us to be that kind of an example today. He doesn't call us to run around like crazy people handing out different kinds of materials to people or arguing with them about the scriptures. He calls us to be an example, to be strong in the Lord, Ephesians 6:10 through 18, to live as shaliachim, as representatives of God, Mattityahu 5:13 through 16, to honor His name in all that we do, Colossians 3:17, 2 Timothy 2:19. But God's truth stands firm like a great rock, and nothing can shake it. It is a foundation stone with these words written on it: Adonai knows those who are really his. A person who calls himself a follower of Mashiach should not be doing things that are wrong. Things that are wrong are things that the Torah tells us are wrong. And now I'd like to look at chapter 11. Again, I hope that you have read this. We're not going to take the time to read it now, but if you haven't read it, please read it before going forward. Chapters 9 through 14 discuss the future, Israel's future, the world's future, and Mashiach's kingdom. Chronologically, the fulfillment of chapter 11 precedes the fulfillment of chapters 9 and 10. You might want to go back and review those. Chapter 11 speaks of the visitation of God's wrath. Our prophet, Zechariah, depicts Israel's complete desolation from north to south. This is, of course, speaking of the 10 northern tribes. Lebanon, with its cedar trees, will be devoured by fire. Foreshadowing their own fate, the cypress and oak bewail the fate of the cedar and of the impenetrable forest itself. The young lions cry against the destruction of their home among the oaks of the Yarden. This passage is a specific reference to God's judgment upon Israel at the hands of the Romans. As with the causes of the Babylonian exile, the indication is of the filling of the cup of rebellion and rejection. Israel's national rejection of Yeshua as Mashiach was the final act of rebellion and rejection of God. Yeshua said that if we had understood and followed Moshe and the prophets, we would have known him. And of course, if you read what Rav Yeshua said, you will be reminded clearly of the prophets that came before, of the prophet that we're studying now, but also of Chezkel, of Yirmiyahu, of Yeshayahu, and of the 12 that we're going to be studying. Because the people first rejected Torah and then rejected the prophets that God sent to encourage them back to following Torah. Because they did not follow them. Because they did not respond positively. They did not recognize as a nation that Yeshua was Mashiach. Of course, we do know that perhaps as many as a third of those living in the land did believe that he was Mashiach. God's commission to Zechariah was a symbolic act in the character of the vision that we see here in chapter 11. Zechariah, acting for Mashiach, is told to feed the flock of slaughter. This is Israel awaiting judgment, as we've seen in other places, but also Tehillim 44, verse 23, Ivritim 13:20, Yochanan 10, 1 through 18, Shimon Kifa Aleph 2:25 and 5:14. You might look those up. Israel was bought and sold on the open market by foreign oppressors. These oppressors felt absolutely no guilt for their actions. They blasphemously bless God for the results of their transactions. And Israel's own shepherds have no compassion even upon their own sheep. God himself declares that he will no longer take pity upon Israel with these results: internal wars and conflict, despotism at the hands of foreign rulers, the physical desolation of the land itself, and no deliverance. Zechariah performed the commission of verses 4 and 5, taking two tools to aid him. The first staff is pleasantness, favor, or beauty, to protect from external enemies with God's favors. The second staff is bands or binders, to protect them from internal strife by uniting the nation. God declares that because his soul is weary of Israel's constant rebellion, he will end the three mediatory offices: Hanavi, the prophet, the Cohen, priest, and Melech, the king. This conclusion of the mediatory offices indicates a deferral of God's covenant relationship with Israel. In a sense, this was also true whenever Israel was outside the land. It is significant that at the time of Mashiach's first coming, Israel had ceased to maintain these offices. Mashiach embodies all three. Immediately, calamity befalls Israel. Death arrives due to famine or pestilence. Because God no longer restrains our enemies, violence comes at the hand of a foreign oppressor. There's also civil strife and disunity. Only the humble, the poor, understood the full impact of Zechariah's symbolic act of breaking the staff. The shepherd addresses his people through Zechariah. He asks for his wages, the fruit of his ministry among them. See Mattityahu 26 and 27. And what do they give him? 30 pieces of silver. According to Mosaic law, this is compensation paid for a slave that is gored to death by an ox. Israel's literal answer is that any slave would be as useful as he has been. God tells him to cast the silver to the potter. In the Mikdash, an act indicative of throwing the silver away on nothing. Finally, the second staff is broken, indicating the breaking up of the nation into hostile factions and parties. This passage, 11 verses 1 through 14, speaks of Israel at the time of the Second Temple, now under Roman rule, when God had already broken the first staff. At this time, of course, we know that there were many factions, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Zealots. the Essenes, there were many others. They were all vying for the attention of the average person, conflicting with one another. The Sadducees holding the power over the temple. The Pharisees really holding the attention of the people. Then Yeshua came, and the Jewish establishment rejected his claim to be Mashiach. Well, of course they would. They had a vested interest in maintaining their power. After Yeshua's death and resurrection, the second staff was broken. In 70 CE and in 132 to 135 CE, Israel was scattered, sold as slaves on the slave market of the world. And they lost the coherence as a nation. The Romans took away both their homeland and their nationhood. This was done purposefully, with full knowledge of what they were doing. They sought to destroy the people of God. They also hoped to destroy God himself. This was a battle not simply between Rome and Israel. This was a battle between the gods of the Romans and the God of Israel. And you can see it in their statuary, where captive Israel, controlled Israel, destroyed Israel, is seen powerless. The Romans are all powerful for a time. The wicked shepherd of the last verses is a view of the tribulation period before Mashiach's return. God now tells the prophet to represent the wicked shepherd. Foolish here is used in the sense of moral weakness. This wicked shepherd, will be allowed by God to have his full way, but only for a time. He will be equipped with the instruments of his work. A description is given of his character. He will be without compassion or concern. He will not seek to find the lost. He will not heal the breach. He will not feed the sheep. He will use the sheep for his own ends, destroying them in the process. And God describes his judgment. God will bring the sword against his strength, against his right arm. The right arm is symbolizing strength, and bring it to nothing. God will bind him so that he may no longer use his vision to destroy Israel. This is the false Messiah who will claim to be Israel's true Mashiach. When he is fully in control, he will turn against Israel, bringing greater destruction than has ever been known. We read about this in Daniel 11, in Yochanan 5:43, in 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 1 through 12, Yochanan Aleph, chapter 2, verses 18, 22, and 26, Yochanan Bet 7, and Hittigalut 13, 11 through 18. Here are some thoughts on chapter 11. The staves used by Zechariah to guide and guard Israel these are also necessary in our lives today. Our shepherds, and each one of us, need God's favor to protect us from the enemy and from spiritual dangers. We need cohesion and unity to draw us together as a community and to keep us from internal conflicts. God provides the shepherds He has appointed with spiritual tools to enable them to guide and assist us and to pray for the community to which God has brought them. Mashiach is Hanavi. He is Kohen Hagadol. He is Melech. We need no other mediator to intercede for us with Hashem. In chapter 11, we see a view of the false Messiah, Hasatan's emissary. There are many like him on a smaller scale, as there always have been in the world of the past, certainly in the world today. Wicked shepherds who deceive. They can be identified easily. They have no true compassion. They do not seek to turn people to God, but to themselves. They do not offer God's healing power. They do not provide spirituality for needy souls. They use the sheep for their own ends, ultimately destroying them. The Good Shepherd is everything these false shepherds are not. Yeshua said, I am the Good Shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life on behalf of the sheep. Also, I have other sheep which are not from this pen. I need to bring them, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. So what God does is He brings in those from outside who have not been His sheep. He brings them into the pen so that He can take care of them and watch over them, and they become one with the people of Israel. Yochanan 10, 14 through 16. Next week, we will move on to chapters 12 and 13. Please read ahead. I hope that you are challenged and also blessed by what we're doing here, and that you will be encouraged to study more on your own and read ahead to the 12, which we're going to be looking at very soon. May God bless you with full knowledge of Him. May His truth bear you up and encourage you today. Shabbat Shalom. Until then, we look forward to Shabbat. We look forward to being together. May God bless you with His rest.